humanitarian assistance or disaster relief, if indeed that's needed?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People in the overseas territories will be reassured to see their plight being raised by my honourable friend in the House today. HMS Medway and RFA Argus are already on post in the Caribbean. Additional naval assets and personnel are on standby. The commitment of our armed forces to support the overseas territories in times of pandemic or national disaster or whatever else is unwavering.
I now call Minister Johnny Mercer to answer the substantive question tabled by Christian Wakeford. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I should like to answer questions 19, 20, 21, 22 and 23 together. I have used this unprecedented situation to continue to modernise and improve our support to veterans in the UK. Last week, I launched the first stage in placing veterans' care in the palm of the hand of every veteran in the country with the launch of the smartphone application of Vets UK. I've also secured £6 million of funding from the Treasury for service charities at this time.
Christian Wakeford. Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although the UK was unable to celebrate VE Day as originally planned because of the threat of COVID-19, it's still important we remember and support the veterans who bravely played their part in fighting for peace and sacrificed so much for our freedom. The UK's Armed Forces Compensation Scheme, which helps veterans claim for injuries obtained while in the Armed Forces, was temporarily paused due to COVID-19 lockdown. Can the Minister assure my constituents that payments will be made as soon as possible, and when will those payments be made?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. I'm afraid he may be slightly misinformed. We haven't missed any payments at all. We made 470,000 payments last month. Veterans Care has not been suspended in the UK. We have, as the Secretary of State alluded to earlier, changed the way we provide services. I'm unaware of a single veteran currently in the care of Veterans UK who has not had their need met during this time.
Go over to Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but that's not good enough. Other government departments and businesses have found ways of operating call centres safely. So at a time when the nation has been awed by the efforts of Captain Tom Moore, why has the Ministry of Defence closed its vital Veterans UK helpline, the telephone service? It's not good enough.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm certainly not going to take lectures on what is and isn't good enough from a Labour Party whose veterans care that I myself experienced over a number of years. No services have been closed. We've changed the way of doing business. Clearly, we cannot do new face-to-face consultations at this time. Again, I would reiterate, there is not a single veteran in the care of Veterans UK who has not had their need unmet at this time. And I would caution members against politicising what is clearly a very important issue.
We go over to Paula Barker. Paula Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Half of respondents to a recent Army Family Foundations said they had received no information at all about the Ministry of Defence future accommodation model. What is the government doing to rectify this?
Minister.
So again, Mr. Speaker, I find that hard to believe because we have actually gone out on a huge programme of engagement around future accommodation model. This is a significant part of what this government's doing to invest in what we call the offer to keep people within the military. If anybody requires that information, they're more than happy for them to get in touch with me. We've used Armed Forces, Families Federations, publications and so on. I'm always happy to do more. This is a communications battle we're determined to win. It's a positive step and I look forward to engaging further with Armed Forces, Family Federations in future.
The final question from Emma Hardy from Hull. Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has heard me speak previously about how fortunate veterans are in Hull to be supported by the Hull Veteran Support Centre and Hull for Heroes, and they have been doing an incredible job providing resources and mental health support. But I remain concerned that these are charities and therefore are competing with all other charities for donations at this time. So my question is, what specific funding can the Minister make available to support veteran charities?
Honourable friend for her question. I pay tribute to Hull for Heroes, who she knows I've been in contact with. They've done an amazing job during this time, as have many of the veterans sector. We have secured an initial £6 million out of the Treasury to support veterans charities at the time. But make no mistake, the environment that these charities operate in is changing. It will change as a result of COVID-19. And I'm absolutely determined to make sure that that ambition that this Prime Minister has set, that this is the best country in the world to be a veteran, is realised in due course.
Excellent. We now come to the urgent question. I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, and wishing him a happy 40th birthday. And the urgent question for Annalisa Dodds, as on the order paper, the Minister should speak for no more than 3 minutes. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your warm wishes. Mr. Speaker, would the Shadow Chancellor...
Yes,
fine. Okay. Brilliant. There she is. Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's plan is one of the most comprehensive anywhere in the world. We have provided billions of pounds of cash grants, tax cuts and loans for over 1 million businesses. Tens of billions of pounds of deferred taxes, income protection for millions of the self-employed, and a strengthened safety net to protect millions of our most vulnerable people. These schemes speak to my and this Conservative government's values. We believe in the dignity of work, and we are doing everything we can to protect people currently unable to work. Yesterday, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, set out our plan for the next phase of the public health response. And today, I can confirm the next stage of our jobs retention scheme. This scheme has been a world-leading economic intervention, supporting livelihoods and protecting futures. 7.5 million jobs have been furloughed. Jobs we could have lost if we had not acted. Nearly 1 million businesses supported who could have closed shop for good. And as we reopen the economy, we will need to support people back to work. We will do so in a measured way. I can announce today that the job retention scheme will be extended for 4 months until the end of October. By that point, we will have provided 8 months of support to British people and businesses. Until the end of July, there will be no changes whatsoever. Then from August to October, the scheme will continue for all sectors and regions of the UK, but with greater flexibility to support the transition back to work. Employers currently using the scheme will be able to bring furloughed employees back part-time. And we will ask employers to start sharing with the government the cost of paying people's salaries. Full details will follow by the end of May, but I want to assure people today of one thing that won't change. Workers will, through the combined efforts of government and employers, continue to receive the same level of overall support as they do now, at 80% of their current salary, up to £2,500 a month. Mr. Speaker, I'm extending this scheme because I won't give up on the people who rely on it. Our message today is simple. We stood behind Britain's workers and businesses as we came into this crisis, and we will stand behind them as we come through the other side. Thank you.
We now call Annalisa Dodds, who is virtual, to speak for no more than 2 minutes. Annalisa Dodds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question. And I'd obviously also like to wish the Chancellor many happy returns. As a constructive opposition, we want to work with government to ensure people's jobs and incomes are protected, and a critical element of that is the furlough scheme. Now, many of the over 6 million people who are currently furloughed were taken aback by comments made in the media by government spokespeople suggesting that, for example, people needed to be weaned off an addiction to this scheme. There were many intimations coming that changes might have been announced to that scheme by the Chancellor, potentially in the media, without the opportunity for proper scrutiny. Now, clearly, I have only heard about these changes in the last few seconds. We will look at them very, very carefully, but there are some critical principles that the Chancellor surely must follow as he redesigns this scheme. First of all, we must acknowledge that people did not want to be furloughed. It occurred through no choice of their own, through following government advice about the closure of sectors. Therefore, it's critically important that they are not penalised for that choice. I welcome the flexibility mentioned. We have asked for this repeatedly, and of course it applies in many other countries. It has been a long time coming, but I welcome the fact it's occurring now. That flexibility in and of itself includes an employer contribution. So he needs to provide more information about that employer contribution now. He also needs surely to provide more information about the alternatives to this scheme. Other countries have job creation, training schemes, redeployment schemes. We do not have them yet. I want to ask the Chancellor to work with me, trade unions, businesses, local authorities, further in higher education, to create that support that's so desperately needed. Thank you.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Shadow Chancellor for her warm wishes as well, and thank her for the, I think, constructive support of the announcement today. Just to address two of the specific points she raised. First of all, the use of the word addiction is not one that I have ever used and not one that I agree with. Nobody who is on the furlough scheme wants to be on this scheme. People up and down this country believe in the dignity of their work, going to work, providing for their families. It is not their fault that their business has been asked to close. It is not their fault that they have been asked to stay at home. And that is why I established this scheme, to support these people and their livelihoods at this critical time. So I wholeheartedly agree with the Shadow Chancellor in that regard. In terms of the next steps, I'm pleased to tell her that I have already been talking to the Trades Union Congress and indeed the CBI in particular about the future of helping those to get back into work who unfortunately may lose their jobs through this period. It is something that weighs heavily on my mind. Every person who loses their job through this difficult period is a person that this government is determined to stand behind, whether that's with new skills, new training, or indeed supporting businesses to create new jobs. That's something that we are determined to make sure happens, and I look forward to continuing my conversations with members opposite and indeed with the trades unions and indeed the CBI and other business groups as we look forward to a brighter future, Mr. Speaker. As we get through this crisis, people can come back to work and we can indeed create the jobs, the opportunities and a brighter future for tomorrow.
We now go over to the Chair of the Select Committee, Mel Stride. Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I broadly welcome the statement that the Chancellor has made relating to furlough and in particular the additional flexibilities that he has outlined, most notably around part-time working. But as we come through this crisis, a number of businesses, many businesses will be saddled with very significant debts just at the time that we're looking to those businesses to invest and grow the economy. So would my right honourable friend agree with me that it's absolutely vital that the government comes forward as soon as possible with a clear plan as to how it is going to assist those companies with that indebtedness in terms of debt forbearance and also equity finance, so that they can fire up the economy and grow the jobs that the country will so desperately need?
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. As always, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. What I would say to him is, I agree, debt is not the answer to all businesses' problems at this time, which is why we have provided business with unprecedented degrees of direct cash support, cash grants of £10,000 or £25,000 for up to 1 million businesses, 750,000 businesses benefiting from a cut in their business taxes and indeed tax deferrals. All of that will help. With regard to equity and supporting the future, I hope he will agree that the Future Fund that we announced will be part of that solution, where the government is matching essentially quasi-equity investments in early-stage companies to ensure that they are here to power the growth and the innovation that we will need as we recover from this crisis.
We now go to north of the border to the SNP spokesperson, Alison Thewlis, with 1 minute. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish the Chancellor a very happy birthday. The coronavirus job retention scheme has kept people from unemployment, a cost to the other parts of the UK government spending and to the economy as a whole. So I welcome his commitment to extend to October and to look at flexibility within the scheme, because that is something that many, including the SNP, have been calling for. But we await the detail of that before too long, I would hope. Does he recognise that removing or reducing wage support levels in the furlough scheme prematurely would increase universal credit claims, force workers back to work before it's safe for them, and risk a second peak? The Scottish Government have been clear that the stay-at-home advice has not changed. So will he commit today to ensuring that the job retention scheme will remain in place in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland if our lockdowns continue longer than England? And lastly, will he commit to looking at the gaps within the scheme for new starters? And will he look at those businesses who are still waiting for money under the scheme? Because he said he would do whatever it takes, and if he doesn't fill those gaps, that will ring very hollow.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her warm wishes as well. Just to clarify, there will be no reduction in the level of support for those on the scheme. That is a commitment that I made earlier. So I'm not entirely sure whether I understood the question right, but it's crystal clear that those on the scheme have that reassurance. The level of support they will receive will not be changed. That will now be shared, those wages and support, by the government and employers, but the levels and percentages of support will not change. I committed to bringing forward further details by the end of this month, where we work through some of the technical details of implementing part-time furloughing. And as I said at the outset, this is now an extension for 4 months to the end of October, which will provide 8 months of support in total to all regions and all sectors of the United Kingdom, and provides, I think, a very good and generous runway for businesses and firms to plan against, and indeed to start getting back to work when the time is right, as per the Prime Minister's plan that was outlined on Sunday and Monday.
We now go to Ben Everett. Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that international comparisons should be made carefully, but I do note that polling released yesterday shows that the UK is considered to be the best in the world for supporting businesses and jobs during the crisis. So what steps is the Chancellor taking to ensure that this success is continued for companies in Milton Keynes and elsewhere as we gradually come out of the lockdown?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for that mention. That is indeed right. I was pleased to see polling that showed that people in this country felt that businesses were well supported compared to almost any other developed country. And indeed, the full scale of the economic intervention that we have put in place as a percentage of GDP stands as one of the most comprehensive anywhere in the world. I'm very happy to continue listening to my honourable friend to see what more we should be doing to support his businesses in Milton Keynes as they look forward to a future where they can start to reopen, start to get their employees back to work, and start to rebuild our economy as we emerge from this crisis.
We go down to Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the continuation of the furlough scheme and its new flexibility to allow part-time work, vital for business in Brighton, particularly those in tourism and hospitality. Would you consider further support to that sector by a reduction in VAT on tourism? It's a policy which many of his own government MPs support. And can I ask him if you will consider revising the self-employed scheme by including small business owners who take their income in dividends, as well as those who combine PAYE with freelance work?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, those who work for their own companies can indeed avail themselves of the CJRS for the PAYE part of their income already. And with regard to support for the hospitality and leisure sector, I agree it's the sector that has been most impacted by what we are all going through, which is why it's a sector that's received the most support, with cash grants of up to £25,000 for those businesses. Almost 1 million are eligible, and indeed an entire entire business rates holiday worth almost £12 billion for the entire 12 months of this financial year. And I do believe that is considerable support. But of course, as we emerge from this crisis, I keep all economic measures under review.
We go up to Bury North with James Daly. James Daly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Chancellor for the speed with which he has managed to get so much money out to help my constituents in Bury? Does he agree with me that the coronavirus job retention scheme is one of the most generous in the world? And can I express my gratitude to him for supporting so many jobs in my constituency and throughout the country, many of which would have been lost without these schemes?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for his support, and he's absolutely right. In Bury, as elsewhere, businesses have benefited from the support that this government has put in place. They have been able to retain their employees through using this scheme, and that means that Bury, when we get through this crisis, can be on the forefront of making sure that our economy bounces back as strongly as it can. And I look forward to hearing from him what more we can do to support his constituents and his businesses through this crisis.
We stay in Greater Manchester with Kate Green. Kate Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Mayor of Greater Manchester's United We Stream initiative has raised thousands of pounds for our creative industries, which make a vital contribution both to our economy and to socio-emotional well-being. But with the sector likely to be among the last to exit lockdown, and with many of the artists working either on a freelance or self-employed basis, can the Chancellor confirm that full support will be given to that vital sector for as long as it's needed?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my right honourable friend, the Culture Secretary, is engaged extensively with that sector as part of planning for a future where people can get back to work and sectors can reopen in a responsible and safe way. So that work is already undergoing. But of course, many people in that sector are benefiting already from our self-employment income support scheme, which opens this week for applications, and people will start receiving their lump sum payment as early as next week. And I know that will make an enormous difference to the many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who work in that sector and will benefit from that scheme.
We now go down to Dover to Natalie Elphick. Natalie Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I also welcome the Chancellor's announcement today on furlough. P&O and many ferry operators are benefiting from millions of pounds of support that the Chancellor has provided through furlough and freight. However, last night, P&O, which is headquartered here in Dover, has announced redundancy plans for over 1,000 jobs after its Dubai owners failed to provide the support that the company needs. Does the Chancellor agree with me that companies and their investors, like Dubai, cannot simply rely on taxpayer handouts, but need to play their full part in investing and supporting British businesses and British jobs at this time?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is an excellent advocate for the freight industry and the importance of the port in her town, which does so much to help fuel the growth of our country, which is why I was pleased to extend support to the sector to maintain our vital freight links. But she is absolutely right. As I said at the outset of this crisis, we are in this together. Everyone has to play their role, and that means employers and companies as well doing their bit to support and protect their staff to the best of their ability and pitch in to help get through this crisis. I'd be happy to talk to her further if there is more that she thinks we can do.
Now go up to Birmingham with Shabana Mahmood. Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Women are considerably more likely to be furloughed than men, and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities is already being investigated from a health perspective by Public Health England. Has the Chancellor assessed the equality impact of all of his package of economic measures on women and our BAME communities? And if so, will he publish that impact assessment?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, what is clear and is emerging is that the sectors and the people that are most impacted by this lockdown are disproportionately women, as the honourable member mentioned, and those in lower paid sectors who probably are financially less resilient, and it's why this scheme is so important. It is so important in providing that job security and that income security to millions of people. And that is why today I've made the decision to extend this scheme to maximise the possibility that those people will have that job to go back to. But she can rest assured that I keep a very careful eye on all the impacts of this scheme, but I do believe it is benefiting some of the most vulnerable in our society today.
James Sunderland. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor will be aware of widespread concern about the future of our commercial airlines, not least in constituencies like mine, near Heathrow, Gatwick and other major hubs. The CEO of International Airlines Group appeared yesterday before the Transport Select Committee and made it clear that job losses at British Airways were only being considered as a direct result of the pandemic. What further support might be available from the government for UK aviation? Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, companies in the aviation sector, like all others, can benefit from the considerable range of support measures already announced, and indeed I know many companies in that sector are benefiting currently from the jobs retention programme. Of course, individual companies have the opportunity to engage with the government on a bilateral basis where that is appropriate, and obviously it wouldn't be right for me to comment on those conversations.
Go over to Sir Edward Davey. Sir Edward Davey.
Can I give the Chancellor a small birthday present by welcoming the extension of the furlough scheme and the greater flexibility for employees coming off furlough, not least because Liberal Democrats have been campaigning for an almost identical package. But can I urge him yet again to look at those employees and self-employed who've not been helped at all and who are in dire straits, people who've moved jobs but were not on their employer's payroll by mid-March? Could he consider the new starter scheme I proposed in early April? And could he please review his refusal to properly help those self-employed people who operate from limited companies and who have just been cut adrift?
Right.
Mr. Speaker, the self-employment scheme in this country remains one of the most generous and comprehensive anywhere in the world. It was designed to provide support to those people who have a different pattern of working. As I've explained previously to the Right Honourable Gentleman, there is a difficulty in differentiating between the dividends that company directors earn from the dividends that anyone might earn through owning a passive share portfolio. I have seen the proposals that he and others have sent. Of course, my team and I have considered those and are considering those, but it does not take away from the fact that what is open this week is a scheme that will support millions of those in self-employment and will enable them to receive the same level of support as those in employment, starting with cash coming into their accounts as early as next week.
Now go to Dame Cheryl Gillan. Dame Cheryl Gillan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his announcement today, and also in particular on his handling and the support he is providing to businesses and individuals during this crisis. Many of my constituents in Chesham and Amersham work for British Airways, who, despite furloughing nearly 23,000 staff, have been threatening to make over 12,000 staff redundant. Can he send a clear message to British Airways today that with this extension, they should now remove all threat of redundancy, which has been adding to the anxiety and stress of so many of their hard-working and in many cases long-serving staff?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, like my honourable friend from Backnall, my right honourable friend is right to advocate and support for her constituents employed by those in the airline industry. And she is right to urge employers to do the right thing at this difficult time. The government has provided considerable support to companies to help them get through this crisis, and she knows what will benefit her constituents, and I will continue to support her in those efforts to make sure that we can protect as many of those jobs as possible.
We cross over into Wales with Kevin Brennan. Kevin Brennan.
Prynhawn da, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor has said that he's doing everything we can, but has he seen the new starter justice campaign for people who started or are due to start a new job after February the 28th and are still cut adrift from any help from the Chancellor and his schemes? Why has he thrown this particular group of hard-working British people under the bus?
Mr. Speaker, when we announced the job retention scheme, we said, and I said clearly, it would apply for those who HMRC were aware of on the 28th of February. We were able, whilst protecting the taxpayer against fraud, to extend that date to the 19th of March, the day before I made that announcement, which is reasonable in the sense that without HMRC or the government knowing if someone was actually employed, the scope for fraud would be considerable, and I did not think it appropriate to expose the taxpayer to that. That change to the 19th of March brought in 230,000 of the 350,000 odd that the Right Honourable Gentleman talks about. Yes, leaving a number of people who could not be covered, but for a reason which I believe is defensible. But what I would say is that this scheme is able to cover the 29.5 million people who were notified to HMRC on that date. Indeed, 7.5 million of them are currently benefiting from it, and we should not lose sight of that. This scheme is doing an enormous amount for several million people up and down this country.
We go over to Sakib Bhatti. Sakib Bhatti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Time and time again, the Chancellor has stepped up to ensure our businesses have what they need to get through this difficult period, and I welcome the measures announced today. The Bounce Back Loan Scheme is another example of the unprecedented interventions that the Chancellor has made, and this has been unequivocally welcomed by organisations such as the FSB. Can my right honourable friend confirm that work is continuing to be done to ensure we're increasing the number of accredited lenders that provide bounce back loans so we can make sure we're getting funds to those businesses that need it wherever they may be?
Chancellor.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his advice as we look to design and improve our lending schemes? I very much value his direct links with business and relaying that to me. What I can tell him, if you'll allow me, Mr. Speaker, for the House as well, to update on the numbers of loans that have now been approved. I'm pleased to say over 250,000 bounce back loans have been approved, 267,000, with over £8 billion of capital that has benefited small and medium-sized companies up and down the UK, and on top of that, 35,000 CBILS loans are worth over £6 billion have now been put out. So that is hundreds of thousands of businesses are benefiting from the loan schemes that my honourable friend helped to implement and helped to ensure that worked well and quickly for businesses.
We go over to the wonder of Lancashire with Rosie Cooper. Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a result of the loss of income, both through fundraising and small service charges, many small and local charities will be really struggling financially, despite being heavily involved and active in the COVID-19 response and supporting our constituents. So when will the Chancellor issue guidance to local authorities on providing grants to charities who are in receipt of local charitable rate relief, but have up to now been excluded from securing the £10,000 grant from the Small Business Grants Fund?
Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, just over a week ago or so, I think, we outlined plans for a top-up fund to local authorities worth over £600 million nationally for local authorities to distribute further rate relief to those businesses that they thought were appropriate, and indeed it will be up to those local authorities to make those decisions, and they could well use that money for that if they so wished. The other thing I would say, Mr. Speaker, is we also unveiled a £750 million package to support charities through this crisis. They are an important part of the social fabric of our country. They are impacted in the same way businesses and the rest of us are, and it's important that we maintain them through this crisis, not least for the valuable work they do on the front line, but also for the contribution they make to our civic society as we come out of this.
We're now going over to the Isle of Wight with Bob Seeley. Bob Seeley.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Isle of Wight is Britain's festival island. We have a unique tourism sector supported by events in arts and music and sport. Can the Chancellor confirm that the furlough extension will help islanders in this devastated part of the economy? And will ministers meet with me and others to discuss how we further protect the visitor and festival economy, which relies on specific parts of the year, sometimes only weekends, to generate an entire annual livelihood? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I could start by saying to my honourable friend to convey the thanks, I think, of the whole House, but certainly of the government, for his constituents and the role that they are playing, trialling the new app that will be important as we look to gain control of this virus in the second and third phase of our approach to tackling it. So please pass on our thanks to all of his constituents. And I can reassure him they are very much in our mind. That sector that he mentioned is one that we know is struggling and will need support. The document that was published yesterday by the government talks about creating an industry task force, so I look forward to working with him and others as we can chart a future for those in the leisure and hospitality and tourism sectors.
Across the border to Dr. Lisa Cameron. Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Disability All-Party Parliamentary Group that I chair believe it is crucial the Chancellor accelerate efforts to include people with disabilities in the Economic Recovery Plan, enabling a disability-inclusive COVID-19 response. Will the Chancellor address this issue by undertaking an impact assessment of the Economic Recovery Plan based upon equalities principles?
Right. Mr. Speaker, of course the government and indeed the Treasury will undertake all appropriate equalities and disabilities assessments for policies as they're unveiled and as is required. What I would say to the Honourable Lady, who I know we have talked about this in the past, is the budget outlines something that both she and I care very much about, which is the issue of changing places for those with complex disabilities, where we created a fund to help local authorities and businesses indeed adapt or build new changing places, which will benefit hundreds of thousands of those, especially young children suffering with complex disabilities and requiring different types of facilities so they can enjoy time with their families out and about. So I hope we can continue to work closely on that as well.
We go to David Johnson. David Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, our honourable friend on a bold move to extend the furlough scheme to October. Hospitality have been concerned that when they reopen, they'll have almost all their running costs, but far from almost all their customers.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to move on to the next question. We're now going over to Bradford with Judith Cummins. Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Treasury made an assessment of how many employers are currently topping up wages of furloughed workers to full pay? If the government reduces the amount they are contributing, many employers may struggle to top up wages. So what will the government do if employers cannot top up wages?
Mr. Speaker, as well as the furlough scheme, we have provided direct cash support to businesses in the form of cash grants or indeed tax cuts, allowed them to defer taxes like VAT, and also have provided them with access to discounted and attractive loans to ease with cash flow. I believe in some that represents a considerable amount of support for business, and indeed have stretched and extended the furlough scheme so it will now cover 8 months, and sitting alongside the plan that the Prime Minister outlined will provide businesses with, I think, a generous and sufficient amount of time to help bring their employees back to work. Indeed, they will also be able to benefit from the part-time flexibility to ramp up their operations.
We go over to the Chamber with Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the world-leading package of measures that we're providing to support both livelihoods and businesses through this pandemic, helping a huge amount of people in Runnymede and Weybridge. Aviation is crucial to my constituency due to our proximity to Heathrow, and many constituents have contacted me, not just employees of BA, but logistics firms and all associated with the aviation industry. Getting our planes flying again is crucial to our economy through air freight and just-in-time supply lines. And would my right honourable friend therefore agree with me that in addition to direct support to the carriers and industry, we also need to get planes flying again as soon as possible?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend is very focused on this issue for his constituents, given the location of his constituency, and he is right to do that. Of course, aviation is impacted considerably by this, but he is right. The best way to help in the end is for us to find a way to control this virus, live with it, and indeed reopen those parts of our economy that are currently closed. That is the best long-term way to provide the support to the industry and his constituents that we all want to see.
We go to Helen Hayes. Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The extent of government support available is of cold comfort to those who are still not receiving any support. New starters are being abandoned simply by accident of the date on which they happened to change jobs. These workers could be helped if the government would accept evidence of their employment in the form of a contract of employment. Many of these workers have paid taxes for years. Will the Chancellor reconsider his approach and take further action so that new starters are not left behind?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have much more to add than my previous answer, but what I would say for those who don't benefit from this scheme or others, we have also taken significant action investing several £billion in strengthening our safety net in this country, whether through tax credits, universal credit, the local housing allowance, or indeed the hardship fund provided to local authorities. The most vulnerable in our society through this crisis are seeing considerable extra support from government to help them get through.
We go down to Ashford with Damien Green. Damien Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like others, I'm grateful to the Chancellor for his extension of the furlough scheme, which is a reverse birthday present from him to workers and firms in my constituency. He will want our brilliant creative industries to come out of this crisis intact. And he knows that many people working in them are freelancers or on short-term contracts. Can he give some hope to those producing world-class work, often in precarious circumstances, that this sector will survive and flourish again after this is all over?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. The creative industries play an incredibly important part in our economy in this country, and also are one of our great exports around the world and add to our soft power. And he is right that we should do everything we can to preserve the jewel that is that industry. As I said, I'm talking to my right honourable friend, the Culture Secretary. He's engaged with that industry to find the safest way for those workers to get back to work. We all want to see that happen in a measured and safe way, but he can rest assured that I am also thinking about it from an economic perspective and seeing whether our support schemes and everything else are optimised for that industry as we emerge from this recovery.
We go over to Wales again with Gerald Jones. Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The furlough scheme is obviously hugely welcome, but does need greater flexibility. I hear what the Chancellor says, but we on this side of the House have set out ways in which the furlough scheme arrangements could be adapted to include those new starters who have just missed out without risking fraudulent payments. So will the Chancellor give these proposals urgent and serious consideration?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, we did give consideration to proposals that we received, worked with our systems, and which is why we were able to extend the date from the 28th of February to the 19th of March, which was the day before I made the announcement, and to me is a reasonable and defensible date to choose. I think it is also worth bearing in mind not to underestimate the challenge operationally of creating these schemes and making sure they work for people. And as I said at the time, from announcement to the scheme going live was a matter of weeks. Thousands of people worked their socks off to make that happen, and several million people's pay packets are now being supported and paid because that all works. These things are not straightforward to do, and the ability to change them and add complexity to them will just simply make it more likely that they don't work and more likely that people have to wait a lot longer to get the support that they desperately need at this time.
We now go up to the north with Jacob Young. Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome this fantastic announcement on the coronavirus job retention scheme and thank my right honourable friend for all his department is doing to support businesses in Redcar and Cleveland with CJRS, with Civils and with the new bounce back loans too. Can he reassure me and employers in my constituency that this support will be kept under review so that it reaches those businesses who need it most?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend and constituency neighbour and give him exactly that reassurance and thank him for all he is doing to support his businesses and constituents at this time. And I very much welcome the advice that he has given me, feeding back to me about what he's hearing on the ground from businesses in the North East. He and I have a shared ambition to make sure that Teesside drives our economic recovery as we come out of that. And I look forward to continuing those conversations with him.
Heading north and over the border, we go to Kirsty Blackman. Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, Aberdeen has been hit by the double whammy of COVID-19 and a massive drop in the oil price. Can the Chancellor please tell us when he last had a conversation with the industry, and will he please give consideration to announcing sector-specific support in order to protect my constituents and those in other regions where employment is centred around oil and gas?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, regardless of the industry that companies operate in, they are able to benefit from our furlough scheme. That is something that we were keen to do. It's not something that every scheme around the world necessarily replicates, but we thought taking that comprehensive approach was the appropriate one. So many of the companies she mentioned will be able to benefit from that. Beyond that, I know my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, engages regularly with all sectors on their particular concerns, and I will continue to liaise closely with him.
We go to Neil O'Brien. We're heading south again. Neil O'Brien.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I strongly welcome the extension of the job retention scheme. It's the most generous in the world, and it's saving a huge number of jobs here in Harborough, Erdby and Wigston. One of the great successes of policy in recent years has been a huge reduction in youth unemployment, but the virus is inevitably going to disrupt a lot of apprenticeships and work placements. Is my right honourable friend thinking hard about how we can limit and stop any rise in youth unemployment?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I know he has put a lot of thought into this particular issue, and I look forward to getting his ideas on this. But he's right, as we emerge from this, we want to make sure that those who are most affected by this, especially those who are young and entering the labour force for the first time, who will face a challenge, but also those disproportionately working in these affected sectors of retail hospitality who are also younger, we need to be very cognizant that we have the right support available for them, whether that's skills, retraining, a dynamic labour market, because the economic impact, not just to us all, but to those individuals of not having a close connection with the labour market at that early stage in their life is very damaging for their long-term prospects, and I look forward to working with him to make sure that that doesn't happen.
We go to Jack Dromey. Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, if 800,000 businesses have benefited from the Welcome Job Retention Scheme, then the 800,000 strong world-class automotive industry will be key to recovery, including Jaguar Land Rover, whose Jaguar factory lies at the heart of my constituency of Erdington. Does the Chancellor recognise that the continuation for as long as is necessary of the job retention scheme, together with welcome measures to help companies deeply in debt, battling with liquidity, will be crucial for the future, providing a necessary certainty upon which businesses, workers and trade unions can plan to rebuild?
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I find myself in agreement with the honourable member, and I know he is fortunate to have such a fantastic company locally to him, and I know that they and their workers will be pleased to this government, and indeed their representative is advocating on their behalf. For larger companies, not mentioning that Jaguar Land Rover specifically, we have also extended some of our loan schemes that they can benefit from, and I know many companies in the automotive supply chain, for example, will now be able to benefit from our larger CBILS programme that went live last week and is already lending billions of pounds. But he's right, these various schemes are important. The industry that he mentions is one which is critical to the UK, and I look forward to making sure that they can have as strong and as swift a recovery as possible.
We go over to Mark Harper in the Forest of Dean. Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome the announcement that the Chancellor's made today. It'll be particularly welcome to the businesses in the leisure, hospitality and tourism sector, who are very important in my area and have been very hard hit. I welcome the fact the Chancellor has extended the scheme to October. Should businesses plan on that scheme coming to an end in October if we are able to stick to the timetable set out by the Prime Minister in the government's recovery strategy, or is there any chance that the Chancellor will be able to extend the scheme? I think some certainty for businesses will be helpful.
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course we will keep everything under review, but my expectation is by then the scheme should end. As I've said before, we have stretched and strained to be as generous as possible to businesses and workers, which is why we have made the decision that we've made today, which is important to me personally. But of course, as I've also said, this scheme is expensive. It is the right thing to do. The cost of not acting would have been far higher, but it's not something that can continue indefinitely into the future. 8 months of total support is a considerable amount of time, and now that we have a plan from the Prime Minister with a path to reopening those parts of our economy that are closed, I believe we can get the country back on track, get people back into work, and this scheme will help them do it in a measured way, in a phased way, and protect as many jobs as possible.
We go to Marionnid with Liz Saville-Roberts. Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr, Ifarydd, and can I take the opportunity to wish Pen-blwydd hapus to the Chancellor. In Wales, workplace restrictions have not been changed, as many parts of the country have not yet passed the peak of infection. The economic taps must not therefore be turned off in Westminster before the public health emergency has subsided in Wales. Will the Chancellor ensure that the furlough scheme remains in place for as long as necessary and in such a form as to enable expert-led public health guidance to be followed in each nation?
Mr. Speaker, as I've just said previously as well, this is a UK scheme. It applies equally to all regions, nations and sectors of the country. It is generous in its length, extending all the way to October, and I believe that provides sufficient runway and support to businesses wherever they might be in this country. But I do thank the Right Honourable Member for her warm wishes.
Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my Right Honourable Friend and the Treasury team in bringing together the economic support package that's given businesses and families across the UK the support they need during the lockdown. Obviously one of the most comprehensive packages in the world, and my constituents are pleased that when they needed help, this United Kingdom government had their back. Can my Right Honourable Friend assure me that the work is in progress so that businesses, particularly in the tourism sector, are prepared for when the lockdown restrictions are eased, as it is a significant element of my Dellin's economy?
Mr. Speaker, can I start by thanking my honourable friend for everything he is doing, not just for his constituents, but also in providing advice to me about using his own experience about how best we can support the economy, businesses at this time. I very much appreciate all the time and effort he has put into that, and hopefully he can see the fruit of some of that work in the announcements that have been made. I can also give him that assurance on the tourism sector. That work is underway. The report talked about setting up a task force. I look forward to hearing his thoughts. I know how important it is to his constituency and others. The Culture Secretary and I will look forward to engaging with him, creating a plan to make sure as many businesses as possible can safely open as soon as we can.
We got to Leeds with Richard Bergen. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many minimum wage workers have been furloughed and are now expected to get by on just 80% of the minimum wage, even though rents, bills and food prices haven't fallen. So will the Chancellor implement guarantees so that no furloughed worker is ever forced to live on less than 100% of the national minimum wage?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scheme as it is designed does provide income support of 80% of those wages. Indeed, where those wages are variable, the scheme allows an average to be taken to benefit the employee. We have also strengthened the safety net, as I mentioned earlier, but also crucially, employees who are furloughed are then able to work elsewhere as well to supplement their incomes. That flexibility is often unnoticed, but is very helpful. I know many people are taking advantage of that to boost their incomes during this time, and I do think that the scheme as it is designed provides the support as required to those, especially those on the lowest pay.
Meg Hillier. Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor has spoken about the freelancers who are working often on short-term contracts or for personal service companies. He talked about optimising the existing mechanisms for those people in answer to the Honourable Member for Ashford. But will the Chancellor actually come forward today with a suggestion that there are concrete proposals in play? These are people with clear financial records, often with accountants. So there is a track record. Will the Chancellor support these different types of self-employed people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, they are being supported. The scheme to support them goes live tomorrow, ahead of schedule. Those who are self-employed, whose returns and earnings we are aware of, will be contacted. They are have already been contacted. They're able to apply from tomorrow, and they will receive cash in their accounts for a 3-month grant as early as next week. It is a scheme that is one of the most generous in the world for those who are self-employed.
Steve Bryan.
Excellent birthday work, Mr. Speaker, on the furlough scheme from the Chancellor, and the flexibility being added to it is very welcome. When he announced the original furlough scheme, many of us in this House and outside in the country talked about the self-employed and asked for parity. And he then, notwithstanding the issues that he knows I have with the people left out of the self-employment support scheme, but that scheme, of course, comes to an end very shortly. So returning to the call for parity, can we assume that he is working on an extension to the self-employed income support scheme? Because I know that many, many people will be listening very carefully to what he says about that today.
Chancellor.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know my honourable friend has spoken passionately about this before, and I look forward to continuing those conversations with him. I can tell him, of course, I'm keeping those measures under review. As I said at the time, there is, of course, parity in the level of support, but the nature of the schemes is different in the sense that employers who have been closed, who have to make employment decisions potentially 45 days in advance regarding redundancies, do need to be treated slightly differently in that regard. But I will, of course, continue to keep all things, and including that scheme, under review.
Go over to Ellie Reeves. Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women that are eligible for the self-employed income support scheme but have taken a period of maternity leave since 2016 could receive up to 1/3 less financial support. This discriminates against women on lower incomes in particular, penalises families with young people, young children, and exacerbates the gender pay gap. Will the Chancellor therefore exempt periods of maternity leave from the self-employed income support scheme calculations?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, for all sorts of reasons, people have up and downs and variation in their earnings, whether through maternity, ill health or others. What we have done to deal with this is to provide an average of income over up to 3 years on a look-back basis to smooth all those ups and downs in all people's incomes. It was something that at the beginning stakeholder groups were keen to see. It's something we delivered, and I believe provides the fairest way to treat everybody on a level playing field for whatever their circumstances. A 3 years averaging of their earnings, to me, seems a very reasonable approach to take.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that we need an economic strategy which balances getting some businesses support when they cannot reopen while encouraging others to go back to work? And today we have got that balance right.
Chancellor.
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. The plan that this government and the Prime Minister outlined is one which does exactly what my honourable friend says. For those who can go back to work now, they should do so in a safe way, as the Business Secretary will talk about later today. And as the rest of our economy reopens, they will have the benefit of a furlough scheme that extends all the way to October, provides for part-time flexibility. The combination of all these things means that her businesses and many others can take the time they need to get firing again on all cylinders.
Let's go to Coventry with Zara Sultana. Zara.
Mr. Speaker, it is estimated that the economic impact of the pandemic will hit the West Midlands the hardest. And this week, it was announced that a manufacturer and supplier to Jaguar Land Rover in Coventry South has gone into administration, putting 600 jobs at risk. Will the government therefore step up efforts to protect manufacturing jobs, especially in the automotive industry, and invest in them to provide green, sustainable jobs for the future?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the potential job losses in the honourable member's constituency. To me, every job lost during this period is heartbreaking. It's why I am doing my absolute utmost to provide the support that I can to protect as many as possible. I've said clearly I can't, and nor could any of us, save every single job or business, but I believe the loans, the cash grants, the job retention scheme will all play a vital role in saving many millions of jobs and businesses, particularly in the automotive supply chain. The honourable member is right, that is an important part of our economy and is one that it deserves our support to ensure that it can be a strong part of our recovery.
Now go down to Andrew Griffith. Andrew Griffith.
Mr.
Speaker, the generous and unprecedented schemes my right honourable friend has put in place are doing a really tremendous job protecting thousands of employees, small businesses and the self-employed in my constituency of Arundel and South Downs. Many in West Sussex work in aviation, so in addition to heartily welcoming today's extension of the excellent job retention scheme, may I ask him to at least consider the temporary suspension of air passenger duty as well as testing passengers on arrival as an alternative to the 14-day quarantine to help this vital sector of the economy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable member for his support and also thank him for the advice he has provided me with his extensive experience of business and indeed in his own constituency. He knows I care deeply about the aviation sector, and I know that my honourable friend, the Transport Secretary and Foreign Secretary, are considering the issues that he raised. In particular, the government's been clear that further detail on those quarantine measures will be outlined in due course, but I will make sure that I pass on his suggestion.
We go to Scotland again with Wendy Chamberlain. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In North East Fife, much of the economy is seasonal. Workers who had contracts often agreed months in advance now face no income and no access to the existing support. Fundraising for some golf caddies in St Andrews is underway, and although I applaud local community efforts and their generosity, rather than having them rely on charity, what support can the Chancellor offer to the seasonal workforce this year so that they can actually return next year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, those who were in seasonal work are able to use an average of their earnings over a period, or indeed the same month on a year-over-year basis, if that is a more generous way to calculate their eligibility to the furlough payments. That, I think, is, as I said, the most generous way to treat those in seasonal employment under the scheme and make sure that we reflect their earnings appropriately.
We now go to Mike Wood. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And these measures are exactly what manufacturing firms in Dudley South are being called for as they start to reopen. Will the Chancellor undertake to work with our excellent Mayor, Andy Street, to make sure that West Midlands manufacturing and its needs, its employees, are fully considered as they start the task of rebuilding our economy?
Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance. I look forward to speaking further with him and the excellent Mayor Andy Street as we all work together to drive the West Midlands economy as part of the economic recovery plan, and I know that he, the Mayor, and his businesses can play a leading role in that.
We go back up to Scotland with Miriam Fellows. Miriam Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Chancellor has confounded recent worrying rumours regarding the job retention scheme rate, which caused grave concern to constituents in Motherwell and Wishaw. Will the Chancellor liaise with these to ensure that workers are not forced back to work in dangerous conditions, bearing in mind that the HSE has issued no enforcement actions as yet, and employers may struggle to pay the 20% he's asking whilst ensuring employee safety?
Mr. Speaker, I know my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will be here shortly to provide a fuller answer to the honourable lady's question, but it's right, employees should not work in unsafe environments. We've put in place measures to make sure that that will not be the case, with updated guidance, risk assessments and increased resources for the Health and Safety Executive, but the Business Secretary will update in more detail.
We now go to Craig Whittaker. Craig Whittaker.
Mr. Speaker, I hope you and your family are well. Mr. Speaker, the Calder Valley employs around 19% of its residents in the manufacturing sector, thousands of which are incredibly grateful for the Chancellor's ingenuity around the furlough scheme. On his birthday, however, can my right honourable friend confirm how the announcements today on furlough will be a massive help to those manufacturers as they phase the return to work and deal with the social distances within the workplace?
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Manufacturing organisations in particular were keen to have the flexibility to bring employees back in shifts on a part-time basis whilst being able to furlough them for the remainder of the time as they ramp up operations. So I'm pleased that we could deliver that flexibility today for the second part of the scheme. I think that will be valuable to manufacturers in my honourable friend's constituency and help them get back up to speed as quickly as possible in a way that they can afford as well.
We go to James Murray. James Murray.
Mr. Speaker, Pranjith Chandrapala lived in Hanwell in my constituency
and he drove the 92 bus until 3 weeks ago before he died of COVID-19, leaving behind a loving family, including his daughter Leshy. A week before Ranjith died, the government announced a life assurance scheme for the families of health and care workers on the front line during the COVID-19 outbreak. Will the Chancellor commit to extending the scheme to other frontline workers, and in particular to the families of bus drivers like Ranjith?
Mr. Speaker, my heart goes out to my honourable friend's constituents' family for what they've suffered. They, like many others up and down the country, are losing loved ones who are serving on the front line. They deserve nothing but our admiration and respect and gratitude. I know my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, has put in place a scheme to help those families who have lost loved ones during this crisis.
Heading up to Staffordshire to Aaron Bell. Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Chancellor for all the schemes he's introduced so far, and particularly the extension of the job retention scheme today, which is very welcome. If he is willing to look at a couple of aspects of the other schemes, I think two schemes in particular would benefit from a taper being introduced, as there are currently cliff edges in support for both business grants and the self-employed income support scheme, whereby two people in broadly equivalent positions, one is entitled to support and one isn't. Would he be willing to at least consider the idea of a taper with these schemes?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I think at this point introducing new measures to the schemes would not be possible or desirable because it would just delay their operation. The problem with tapers is there's still always an end point at the other end of the taper. With regard to the self-employment scheme, this covers 95% of all of those who are self-employed, which I think is pretty comprehensive coverage. The 5% who are not covered have an average income of £200,000. So of course there will be hard cases just the other side, but on average this is a group with relatively high earnings.
We go to Flick Drummond. Flick Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Treasury for a very comprehensive set of measures for businesses and employees across the country, including my constituency of Mearn Valley. Can my right honourable friend, though, tell me when further guidance for the discretionary grant funding will be announced, as some councils are not happy with using their discretion, although I believe that the Treasury Department has made it perfectly clear from the start that the list was not exhaustive and that councils should use their own discretion.
I thank my honourable friend for her support. I can confirm that the guidance will be issued imminently, I think I'm safe in saying. Of course, there will be some broad guidelines for who we think that support should be targeted at, but of course local authorities will have the ultimate discretion.
Returning to the North West with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the announcement on furlough, but the Chancellor knows that the government's COVID response would have completely stalled without local government, yet our councils are now financially at the brink. The extra funding doesn't cover all the costs, something ministers promised. Will he ensure our councils are fully reimbursed for all COVID-related costs and lost income and protect the sector that's protected us?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in a moment of nostalgia, I know the right honourable member and I have a shared passion for local government and admiration for the work they do, and I know he will remain an advocate of theirs. They have been provided with over £3 billion of extra support. Of course, we're in constant dialogue with local government, whether in social care or others, to make sure that they get the financial resources that they need.
Over to Derbyshire with Nigel Mills. Nigel Mills.
Can I thank the Chancellor for his announcements today, which are exactly what Amber Valley businesses have been asking for? Is there any way he could allow them to bring some employees back part-time earlier than his extension so they can perhaps reopen their businesses next month rather than have to wait till later on?
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a very fair question and one that I've looked at, Mr. Speaker. I think there is a question of operational complexity in designing the part-time aspect of the scheme in consultation with business and unions to make sure that we can enforce it properly. The earliest I think we reasonably can do it is in the extension period, as I mentioned. You know, of course, if there's ways for us to do that sooner, we will, but I wouldn't want to commit to that today, as it is a complicated thing to get right.
We now have our final question. Ruth Jones in Wales. Ruth Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I asked the Prime Minister about engagement with the devolved governments in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. I'd like to try again today and hopefully receive a more detailed response from the Chancellor. Can you please outline what specific conversations he had with the devolved administrations regarding these changes and when these conversations actually took place?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, speaks regularly to his counterparts in the devolved administrations. We do engage with them regularly. I'm pleased to say that over £8 billion of Barnett consequentials have been provided to devolved authorities across the United Kingdom as they also tackle this response, and that will continue to be the case. We will get through this as one country altogether.
I will now suspend the House for 15 minutes and will return at 1:50. Thank you, everybody.